QSO Today, episode 502, Lewis Hammer, 4Z5OT. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. I want to thank this week John Grusel, KC9OJV, for his $10 monthly sponsorship, Scott Nacy, KK6IK, for his $100 yearly sponsorship, and Bill Salyers, AJ8B, who made a $30 recurring monthly donation. You too can make a recurring donation for any amount beginning at $5 per month. Recurring donations are the backbone of the podcast and keep it on the air. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. If you are new to the QSO Today podcast, please be sure to look at the QSOtoday.com website, where we have over 500 interviews with amateur radio operators. From there, you can click on the links that take you to the QSO Today Academy. Our catalog contains over 500 videos on every ham radio subject, completely searchable. Lewis Hammer, 4Z5OT, is a good friend here in Israel and has taken outdoor and park operations to a new level. Faced with antenna challenges at home and inflexible neighbors, operating events like lighthouses on the air and other portable operations has opened new opportunities for Lewis to be active, gain better operating experience, and to be ready with his portable rig in a flash when necessary. 4Z5OT is my QSO Today. 4Z5OT, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Lewis?
Hi, Eric. I am here. Very excited to talk to you today.
Lewis, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your story? When and how did it start for you?
I guess it started actually before I put my ears and mouths into speaking to the radio. It was listening, like lots of young kids, around maybe 13 years old. I had a listening radio. I don't even remember which one it was. I just remember it was gray. And my father's friend, he owned a TV repair shop, Harry's TV Repair in Seattle. It's where I was born. And he always gave me some very important advice from what I was doing at that time. And he said, always sit on a tire, because you're gonna kill yourself one day. Because he knew what I was doing. I was taking apart radios and putting them back together and see if I could get rid of static or something. And it wasn't too long after that the antenna wire was hanging down the wall, and I decided I needed a little more light, and I plugged in a light into the light socket right there, and I got thrown all the way across the bedroom and hit the wall, because I had plugged in my antenna wire with the electric plug.
The wire came down, and when you plugged it in, it was between the two plugs.
That's it, and everything fused.
And that's why he said you should be on a rubber tire, was to isolate you from ground.
Prepare for that event. That's it.
Did you tell your parents?
Oh, yeah, my mom had to come in the room and pick me up off the floor. But they didn't throw away the radio. I enjoyed it. And back in that time period, I think there was, I know there was some outer space ships going around, and I was always trying to listen to astronauts or something, and never did, but it kept me going, kept my ear to the radio.
Did you have favorite stations that you'd like to listen to when you were listening to the radio? Did you have some place that was kind of your regular stop?
No, never did. It didn't. I just kind of try to figure out how far away they were, and then also regular AM. Yeah, I guess it was FM also that was in the radio, and I would be excited that I could pick up a regular AM radio station from San Francisco, and I'm up in Seattle, and kind of learned times of days that would happen.
Did this interest in shortwave radio listening and AM radio listening lead to some interest on the scholastic side? I mean, in high school or college, did you pursue an education in radio?
No, the education came much later. Everything scholastically was just the standard old stuff. Lots of math. I love math, so I excelled in the math element, but didn't get into the electronics at school, no.
What did you choose for your career path?
I love numbers, so I kind of went into accounting, and then I didn't want to be an accountant, so it ran into just business administration at the University of Washington. And I never really did anything with the radio in college. Went into grad school down in Salem, Oregon at Willamette. And that's when I got married, and together my wife and I said, you know what, when we're poor college students, so this is a good time when we graduate, let's move out of the country. And we were both Zionistic. We both worked at summer camps for youth, Jewish kids, and we liked that environment. So it kind of said, okay, instead of doing any recruiting work at grad school, I told my professors, I'm not going to go to your meetings of recruiting because we're leaving the country at the end of this 2-year time period. And in fact, my thesis papers all had to do with economics of Israel to prepare me for moving over here. So it was, and they were happy for that. It was kind of exciting.
When was that?
So that would be 76. I was in grad school in 1976, 77. It was a 2-year program. We got married then, and then immediately, as they say, moved to Israel in 1977.
I kind of remember Israel in those days. It wasn't the first world country it is now. It was a little primitive.
It was primitive, to say the least. You know, you didn't have phones, you didn't have much of anything, but that's why it was easy for us to make the move, because we didn't have anything either, you know, just getting out of school. But I did get a good job with the Israeli government as an economist, and we were working in Jerusalem. And a little bit later, we decided to do one of these settlements, you know, or cooperatives, I guess you would call it. And we moved up to the Galilee, just kind of inland from Haifa and Akko up in the Galilee area, a group of other English-speaking young families. And this is really where the start of the ham radio began, because we had 30 families all living together and one telephone. But there was 2 other guys that had ham radios. And I said, whoa, this is kind of neat. And I learned about the ham radios from them, and they had 2-meter radios that would get to Cyprus. You could talk to Cyprus easier than to Haifa, because you needed a phone for Haifa. And one of those fellas, Mike Fisher, he's from South Africa. 4X6IV was his Israeli call sign. He really turned me on to this stuff, and then we actually started a little electronics factory. We were making communication equipment that was with wires. It wasn't wireless. It was like they were either panels for the phone system.
Intercom panels, like for apartment buildings?
No, for switching stations of the telephone company. And then we also were making intercom boxes for the military, and they were, just a regular intercom. The front desk talked to the back desk, and that was kind of cool. Getting my hands dirty.
What was the name of the yeshuv, the community that you created there with a group of people?
There was two of them together. One was called Moshav Shoreshim, which means roots, and the other one was Moshav Shechania. Shechen is like a neighbor. So both of them were living together, and eventually they split apart, and by design they split apart. They were just living together because of convenience, but then they had their own housing section. And Micah and I were in the Shechania group. And with this little electronics factory, I said, you know what, now I have, and you're talking on FM to Cyprus, I want to get a license of my own. I'm not going to just use your license. So there was one fellow that was a very, very Zionistic Texan. He would come to Israel every year. Joe Bonnet, he was at that time W5 W5III. And Joe was just helping Israel as much as he can, and he would go back and forth from Texas to Netanya, was where he usually stayed here. But we became really good friends because my wife is from Texas, and her parents knew Joe. And so we really bonded. And so one time period we came back to Dallas for a visit, and Joe, he said, I'll help you get your license. And he got me a little box for training on CW, and I would be listening and getting back and forth, and got my CW up to get a general license, and all with his help. And that's why I have an American call sign, November 5 Fox Sierra India. And even though I'm from Seattle, it always fools people because I got it when I was visiting my wife's parents in Dallas. And so that was the beginning of a real love for the radio.
And then under the regulations that exist between Israel and the United States, you were able to transfer that license to an Israeli call sign?
Correct. So it was an automatic transfer, and then that's when I got my 4 Zulu 5 Oscar Tango, just because I got the license in America first, and then I showed it to them. And you go into the office in downtown Tel Aviv, and there'd be a list of call signs available, and said, "Oh, that one looks nice," and you'd point at it, and they'd give it to you.
That was in the Shalom Tower.
Correct.
So the Shalom Tower was, I think, the first tower in Tel Aviv. I remember at that time, just for the listeners to understand, that many of us Anglos who've made Aliyah, who've moved to Israel, actually bring our amateur radio licenses from America here, and then we do the same thing that Lewis describes, is that we apply for the amateur radio license here. It's funny, though, we have a number of people in our group, Lewis, that for some reason they have a call sign and the first 2 letters of their name or their last name, but they're backwards. So I have 4Z1UG, which comes from GU.
Right.
There's probably half a dozen other people in our group that have similar kind of call signs where they went backwards.
So was that because that was the only one on the list that you could match?
I never saw the list. I think it was whoever was doling out the call signs to those of us who came later, that they just said, oh, yeah, well, GU, yeah, backwards is UG. And so in the end, that's what we ended up getting. It's kind of serendipitous. So anyway, just also to set the time, in the 70s, I came in the early 80s as a student, and getting a telephone line, you had one line in your community, and it was kind of like Green Acres. They pulled the wire to where they have enough wire to get to, and that might be the general store, or it might be the phone station outside the office or inside the office, but you only had one, and there was, I think, every yeshuv, every community in Israel had an amateur radio station in those days.
And that's how it was with us. It was up at the office, and there was a grocery store there that was open once a week. You'd order what vegetables that you would want. And this was already 1980, I guess, that we had moved up there, and they would tell us, but I don't think it ever happened. They said, if you really want your own phone in your own house, put your name on the list. It's about a 7-year wait.
Unless you were a Histadroot official or you were a member of the Mapai party, there was a lot of protexia. How do we translate protexia?
Protection.
If you had connections.
Yeah, connections.
You could speed up the time that you got the telephone line. But it seems to me ham radio, low bands, 20 meters, single sideband, whatever, was very common to connect to people on the other side of the world, to the United States or to other countries.
Yes.
Phone patches were prevalent.
Phone patches were very exciting at that point. I don't think I used it more than once or twice. But we would really have fun kind of in the middle of that. We would talk to people coming up through the Suez Canal. We'd get a hold of yachties and marine people, and two in particular were just exciting for us. There's this one guy who's sailing his boat for a 7-year time period, just around the world, everywhere. And we were saying, okay, so we talked to him every day at a certain hour on they have them today, the skids for helping the yachties. It's for their safety. So in case they needed something, we were there to help. And then if we lost track of them, we would actually start looking what's gone on with them. But this fellow from France, we said, what are you going to do? He said, I don't know, get up through the canal, and they're going to hang left and, go through the Mediterranean. He says, why go left? There's a few of us up there. We've been talking all this time. Take a right. Come up to Haifa. We can see the Haifa port from here. And he's, okay, I'll have fun. So he hangs a right when he gets through the Suez Canal, and he parks his yacht. And it wasn't a yacht, it was a sailboat. And about a 45-foot, I guess, with 2 masts. And he stayed there for a week, and we'd go sailing with him. And he'd come up with his girlfriend. They were living on the boat together. And they'd come up to us and really get their stability again of what land was like. And we really had a good time. I don't remember his name or his call sign, but that's how the connection was made. Purely friendships made over the airwaves. It was really cool.
Right, and being right at the end of the Suez Canal made that kind of interesting. Did you have more visitors along the way?
Yes, and I'll tell you, this one, it blew my socks off because I don't know if you can see this, I just got his postcard.
We were holding up WA6OJW.
So I only got this within the last year, and the contact was made 1984. And he writes on it, says, I finally got you your QSO card. I just lost track of everything, and then I lost track of you. So I finally got it, and we forgot about him. But I'd always remembered him, but I forgot how to get a hold of him. So I get the postcard, and I'm very excited because what is this about? This, I don't know if you saw the picture of the boat. It's USS Nassau. It's an amphibious assault ship. So this is a phenomenal boat, and it actually sinks a little bit in the water, and other landing crafts go into it, like aircrafts are on the top, but boats go inside the boat. It's full of water, and they drive them in. It's a phenomenal boat. So we get on this boat. He says, yeah, it's 4th of July. Come down and visit me. So he was in port in Haifa because we were talking to him out in the Mediterranean, but then he came into port. And he says, come visit. 4th of July, I'll have someone there to get you through security. So we get there to the port, and it's all the banners are up, and the whole deck is full of people, and they're doing a visitation day. And then he meets us at the dock, and we go up the ramp, and I notice to a T, every single person is saluting him as we're walking around. And I was with my friend Mike Fisher, 4X6IV, and the two of us are just like, what's going on? Why is this guy, everybody's saluting him? And then, so after a while, we kind of say, what's, if we don't mind asking. He says, well, I'm kind of the second in command of the 6th Fleet. So then we found out that, if the first in command is gone, he's the first in command of the 6th Fleet. And here we were his guests.
Would that make him an admiral?
I looked it up.
For the listeners, they're going to have to look it up for us. The second in command, whether that's an admiral or a vice admiral.
It's high. They'll look it up.
Was he in his dress whites?
Yes, definitely.
For 4th of July, yeah, why not?
Commissioned in 1976, the Nassau, 820-foot vessel. So just look up the USS Nassau.
I'll put that in the show notes page.
It's really an exciting thing to be, and like they had the steak. I mean, it would melt in your mouth, this steak. And Israel is known for having shoe leather steak back then, and it was like such a delight for us. Can't have a 4th of July without a nice steak.
Without a nice barbecue.
Yeah, that was really, again, a treat of saying what's better than talking to friends all over the waves is then to meet them. And another one in relationship, not to boats, but just meeting people. At that time period, we had a daily skid on 2 meters to these 2 British guys. One of them, I remember his first name, Jeffrey. I don't remember his call sign. I don't remember his last name. I should, but I apologize. So we talked to him all the time. And back in those days, so 1982-ish, a big fancy computer would be like, what was this, TI 900 or something like that. I forget the names of the little computers are about this big, and you type into a cassette to put your program in.
I remember those computers in those days. It looked like the whole thing was a keyboard. It outputted on channel 3 into your television.
That's it.
Your media was a cassette machine.
So what we did was, who knows if we were ever the first, but we would write a program which would just be a sentence or maybe 2 sentences, and then it would be printed onto the cassette. And then we ran the cassette over the FM, and Jeff would pick it up in his side and then play it in his computer, and then it would print out our message. And we were having a great time just experimenting back and forth and seeing how we could send a message in. That was pre-packet time period, but we were essentially sending, I guess, a packet over the waves.
Right, AFSK. I think at that time I recall also there was a UN post in the Golan Heights that had some hams up there in 81, 82. I remember talking to them on my ICOM little synthesized radio when I was there at that time. What was equipment like? What could you get in Israel in those days, Louis? Or did you bring stuff from the States?
I didn't have my own at first. Mike had a Kenwood, I forget the name, which model, but it was a decent Kenwood. It's HF only.
That might be the 520 or the 820 in those days?
520. That rings a bell. But that was short-lived because then 84, we returned to America. So with one little story in between, actually, when I was in the Army like everybody else and did my training, and then you get a profession within the Army for your reserve duty then when you get called up once a year. And so they said, what are you interested in? And I said, I'm really into ham radio these days. So I got to get into the radio relay segment of the Air Force. And so I learned to set up radio equipment out in the field. Now, most of it actually was communication equipment because we were actually running lines between the different sections, the central command, and when you'd have another set of people maybe a kilometer away, and you'd run a line a kilometer away and put the two together. And I guess it was for security also. They could actually be talking and not be overheard because it was on a line instead of in the air. But at those time periods, it was interesting. We had what was called the beast. So the counterintelligence used to be they would take and block the radio waves. They'd start at one end of the spectrum and it would just go up and around, and you would hear this noise and follow it all through the whole spectrum. And so we called it the beast because of the noise. And so it was a very interesting time period to have a little bit of knowledge of how this stuff worked and what they were doing, because they were trying to trigger things that would do damage to soldiers by remote control. And so they would trigger it before people would have to be making a trip from one spot to the other. And I wasn't part of that, but I saw it and I kind of learned about it. It's kind of interesting.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project that now includes 500 episodes of the QSO Today podcast, the curation of hundreds of hours of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo presentations for public consumption, is now supported completely by you, the listeners. I am using a business model called Value for Value, a concept developed by Adam Curry, K5ACC, where you contribute to QSO Today exactly what you think its value is to you. Value for Value. This mid-show break and the promotion of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast later in the show are the only commercials that interrupt the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors to influence the content, direction, and editorial content of the QSO Today project, which exists solely for the promotion of the amateur radio hobby. Those of you that have listened to over 500 podcast episodes know that I'm not only infatuated by the amateur radio hobby, but by the people who perpetuate it as well. The hours that I dedicate to QSO Today is a half-time job. Your support at any level pays for all of the technology that I use to create, produce, host, and deliver the QSO Today podcast and the project to the ham radio community. And while it is a labor of love, it costs money. I know from statistics and surveys that only 6% of you actually contribute to QSO Today in some form. Please make a generous donation using the slider to set the amount of your donation. Make that donation monthly to ensure that QSO Today is here for the next 500 episodes. As a value-for-value donation, it should be in the amount that you value each episode of QSO Today, or your access to our amazing catalog of ham radio educational videos found on YouTube, Vimeo, and using our own player, link in the show notes page. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually. Use my Amazon link in the right column of the QSO Today website before shopping on Amazon. Promote QSO Today to your friends and family by forwarding our email and social media posts. Subscribe to our mailing lists. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Tell your friends. All of these actions are value for value. Keep the QSO Today project alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO Today. So you went back to the States?
So I went back.
Why did you do that?
We were living on $200 a day up there, and satisfied with only $200 a month. Sorry, I should have. And it was just, but we saw that I'm not going to make it. I love the country, but we had one child at that time, and I just didn't think anything was going to work. So I said, all right, I'm going to go back, try to get a job, and we'll come again in the future. So this was 84, and we went back and talking about a little bit of radio. When we came back, I got the Drake set, the TR3. We had a receiver and a transmitter separate with the Drake system.
I think we called that the Drake line in those days, right? The TR3.
Right. And then it was matched with the receiver. So anyway, that was the first radio, and it really was interesting to learn, but I quickly lost interest because having to try to create a new family in a new place, which was old. I went back to Seattle where, we're generations in the same city, but it wasn't going anywhere for me. So I just kind of lost interest in that and instead trying to make a living and a family. But everything has its purpose because it stuck with me, and we raised a family. And then when the last one, we had 2 kids, when the last one got out of high school, we said, okay, we said we were going to come back, and we then returned again to Israel. And this time I said, if I get a nice radio, I'm only going to bring a few things back this second trip to Israel. And one of them was I bought a new Yesu 897, and I'm glad I did that because it was the first time I ever had a brand new radio, and it worked well, but I couldn't find a good place for an antenna. So even though I had a great radio, I hardly ever used it for about 10 years.
Where did you go, Louis, that you had the antenna problems?
So I was in a little apartment in Jerusalem for a while. And then we moved to the middle of the country, a place called Zikron Yaakov, and did a little bit with a vertical because I had a small backyard and a vertical would work. But no, at that point, again, trying to make a new life, and the time allotment that it takes to really do the right thing was never available to develop the ham radio very far, and kind of went again to the back burner. Then we moved to a water town, the Netanya, right on the beach, and there it seemed good, but the radio was outdated by then. Now we've got about a 15-year-old radio, and it was just, I don't know, not powerful enough in my opinion. And I had a problem with that. I was perfectly positioned to go out to sea, but behind me was all buildings, solid, even my own building, and I couldn't get to the roof, so I couldn't put an antenna up. It was like 6 stories to get up there, and the verticals that I was using, too noisy, so I was getting frustrated. And finally, I was taking a trip back to Seattle, the annual trip, and I said, you know what, they got some really neat new equipment. And I fell in love with the Yesu TDDX10. And it was finally a priced radio that had all the modern bells and whistles. And I bought that and brought it in and made end-fed long wire. And it all came together. It was like, oh my gosh, I'm right on the cliff. The long wire went right out over the sea. None of the neighbors could see the wire. It was 43 meters long of just a thin copper wire. And so it was made in heaven, the whole kit. Finally, a great radio, a great antenna that I made myself. It was a 49 to 1, I guess you balance, some kind of a transformer. It was right in the window. So I had a feed line of about 3 meters long, so no loss of anything, no interference. I started getting out. It was really fun.
So that's an 80-meter half wave?
Correct.
Fed with a 49 to 1 balun.
Correct.
One of the problems that we've had in Israel, I think mostly because when they built all the cellular telephone systems here, is that Israelis are kind of concerned about quote-unquote radiation. Anything that emits a signal is radiation. The kind that comes off of a dental X-ray machine has the same potential for damage that a QRP operator might have in the brains of the average public. So how did you manage your neighbors? Did you manage it by being stealthy or not operating there?
Well, we were in this apartment for about 2 years, and it was total in your face, the neighbors saying, what are you doing? One neighbor below me, when I had a vertical on the patio, you could say it was 10 feet away from his head because his bedroom was up against a wall that was above my patio. And he would complain and say, oh, I have headaches at night because of your transmission. And it was and I would say to him, okay, I'll tell you what, write it down exactly the time of day that you get this headache. And I want to really know when, because if it's when I'm transmitting, for sure, we can do something about it, and it was never at the same time. And then once it was like I was out of the country. And then I came back and he said, oh, yeah, I've been meaning to tell you, this, I'm really having a problem sleeping. And I said, yeah, I had a great time in Seattle. I've been there for a month, so I don't know what you're talking about. So, but then he said, I'll tell you what, I will pay to get your equipment on the other side of the building or up to the roof. And, he wasn't like, you can't do your hobby. It was like, let me try to help you do it. And then that was the time that I figured out this half-wave 80 meter out the other side of the building across an empty field. And then I told him that, and he just, we're good friends anyway. But then the friendship continued because I just told him, okay, I'm no longer on the patio with the verticals or different kind of experimentations of antennas. And so everybody was happy. And then I call it the stealth antenna because I never ever heard from anybody. And I have a picture on my QRZ.
Well, I'll make sure that there's a picture in the show notes as well. So, Louis, it seems to me you enjoy entertaining, and we've had hams that came to Israel that wanted to operate, and you were more than gracious in terms of accepting them and allowing them to operate SOTA or POTA or whatever it is that you're doing. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of operations that you're doing now? Because it seems to me that you're doing a lot of special events or SOTA. Can you talk a little bit about how you're operating now and what you're using to do this operation?
Yeah, I really love field day events. So Israel has, during the time period when I couldn't transmit off my patio and those, I then was invited by a number of more advanced, knowledgeable hams to do things like the, what do you call it, the Migdal, the light tower event.
So you're talking about the lighthouse, the annual lighthouse event, which I think is worldwide, right? You operate from lighthouses.
Right. It's a worldwide event. Yeah. And they knew I was having problems at home. And so then that wet my whistle of saying, you know what, if you can't do it in your own home, try to find events to go to and learn from the elders type thing. And that's where I learned I took now my old, the 897 Yaesu, and I would take that out in the field. I wasn't worried that it would get damaged. So I did a number of lighthouse events, and then we had events centered around ancient synagogues and churches. And what was great about these types of events is that you could be at home with a small station like mine and a weak station, and call CQ to your blue in the face and get one or two contacts. I mean, it's just, you're not really heard out there. And I could never do competition because it was just, couldn't get through the pileup knowledge-wise or technical-wise. But if you go to a field event that had a special call sign, you really had an audience waiting for you there, and pileups happened immediately. And so it solved a problem that I had of how to get the numbers up, how to really talk to more and more people when you don't have the location or the equipment. So I fell in love with going out in the field. We went to the Negev desert once, and it was phenomenal. And you really learn how other people are running, because maybe you've got 15 guys all set up in different locations, not one next to each other, so that you could broadcast at the same time. We did another one with train stations around the country, ancient, not current, but old train station events.
These would be the British train stations.
Correct. And every time you go, you're on a pileup. So it was really good. And then I said, well, now what do I do between these events? Because you're only going to have maybe 2 or 3 a year. So another friend of mine from the Seattle area, Mark Sandler, that's K7MAS, and Mark was really into soda, and not so much just into it, it was like obsession. I mean, he's like on the top tiers worldwide, and he does a soda where you hike in. You might go for 3-hour hike with all your equipment on your back. And so he came to Israel, and he says, come with me. We're going to do some soda activation. I'll teach you all about it. So I would drive. He would stay near me or with us. And we'd hit a couple of soda locations. And in Israel, maybe I'm giving the secret out to other ham operators here, you don't have to hike for 3 hours to get to the top. You drive to the top, and the most you'll hike is 1 kilometer, and it's a really easy thing to activate. You're not allowed anything touching your car. So even if it was only 100 meters, you just had to get away from the car. Couldn't even use the car to go up against your antenna to hold it up. So I then learned about another antenna, and this antenna was a vertical on 20 meters, and that was designed by VK2 PRC. This is Alexander Ball, and he made this design also with a transformer, a Balun, and it works like a dream if you're on a summit, because that's how it's got vertical and then a ground wire in an L pattern, and it just shoots right off the top of a mountain or off of a cliff. He's got some really nice videos on YouTube, and I fell in love with that. So these things, both that one or my long wire, I'll carry fishing poles. How do you make the top? You don't have any trees. If you have a tree, you throw the line up and you pull it up, the transformer up to the top, and then you walk 43 meters away, and I have fishing poles that are like 7, 8, 9, 10 meters long. And because of living in Netanya, which is right on the beach, right on the Mediterranean, a very common fishing pole in this country is like telescoping fiberglass poles. Maybe each section is only a meter or a meter and a half long. no guide wires. It's just a really, really, really long. You buy them 8 meters long, and you put at the end of the fishing line, and you just push it out. That's how you can get out over the rocks. You just drop the rod, and you got a fish on. You bring the rod up, and the fish comes right to you. So I would get these when they break them. They'll break one section out of 6 or 1 out of 7 or even 1 out of 8. Not knowing enough, you just go to the fishing store and you can buy the section that was broken. And I would get 2 that had different sections broken, and I'd put them all together. So I could easily carry a kilometer away an 8-meter long tower, because it's a fishing pole all collapsed. And these are what I would use on the soda expeditions. And it's not that I've done that many. There's 15 in the north of Israel and 10 in the south, and altogether I think I've done 8. So I'm one of the few who have done more than 1 or 2, but I learned from Mark really the system. And again, this fit my style, because even with a good radio now at home, the nice Yaesu, I still don't get that much a reply to my CQ. But the minute that you publish a soda location on the soda net, you've got a pile up. It's exciting. So then you're there for maybe an hour, and then everybody's happy. The other side is very excited to get a Israel call sign, and then it's activated. So and my wife goes on a lot of those with me, because it's not that far of a hike. If it's not, there's another archaeological site next to where I'm at, and she'll do the archaeological site while I'm doing the radio, and that's a really fun way to be outdoors and have your hobby at the same time.
And do you have favorite operating modes when you're operating soda? When you first started, what were you doing?
It was all single sideband voice, and now at home I don't think I could handle a pile up with CW, but at home I'm really trying to develop my CW, and I'm about more than 50% CW at home, but slow. I'm transmitting now 13 words a minute so that no one will come faster back to me. I can actually transmit maybe 15 to 17, but if I do that, then they might come back to me at that speed, and I can't handle it. But I can do 15. I can hear 15 and write it down. But I get here in terms of mentoring. I have a friend from Netanya, Joe Moritz. He's 4X1 November whiskey, and Joe is a purist in CW, and he so pure that he gave me his microphone, because he says, I'm never going to use it. Here, you need an extra mic? Take my mic. Get it out of my shack. I don't want it around, because he only does CW. And also, but I don't mimic what he does, he also only likes between 10 and 20 watts. And he does well with that. And he says, if it's a clear day, you don't need any more than 10 or 20. They are surprised when I come back to them and tell them that that's all I'm using. So, but nor he nor I do competition. I think there's a difficulty when you start getting to competition with this type of thing, trying to go slow or trying to go with low power. But I think the key that I've only recently learned is when you're receiving on CW, you don't have to be 100%. It's a formula. The guy's name, the guy's city, and when you're typing down his call sign, if you actually listen for the call sign ahead of time and do a QRZ.com search for that call sign, you know his name, you know his city, so you can fill in the empty letters that you missed because you know it already, and it's a pleasure to do it. I really, but you have to get over the hump that in the conversation you might miss a word. So what? It's not the end of the world.
So do you find, Louis, that because you are operating more portable operations, that you've kind of have come up with what to take and what to leave at home? Do you think that you actually now pack well and you take just what's necessary to enjoy the afternoon on the hill? And do you have some special requirements now that you do for like power? You could carry lead acid batteries or you could carry lithium ion. Do you have any preferences that from this experience that you now pack for yourself when you go out?
Definitely. I'll say I don't get paid for advertising, but is that not upside down?
That's the BioInno package.
Yeah, the BioPower, and this is a 12-volt, 9-amp, and I have two of these, and you really, they last forever. I have a kit, my Go kit.
12 volts at 9 amps in lead acid, you wouldn't be able to hold it in one hand.
No. You look at this, and I have two of them, so they go well in the backpack, and I've never run out of power, even on a camp out, because I have two of them. So if one goes, then I got the other one. And then usually, if it's not soda, but if it's one of the special ops, somebody's got a generator, and so I'm cheating because I'm using their generator to recharge the battery. But really, you go for even 2 days. I don't run out because they're pretty powerful, and the Yaesu 897 doesn't really demand that much power. I'm not sure why I last so long on it. You could turn it down. You can go down to 50 watts and that make it go even longer. But I also have a little extra thing. This is the one that I take once in a while only for fooling around, and this is the Argo 556.
Argo, that's a new radio or what?
This is an old 10-tac, really, really old guy.
It's an Argonaut.
Right? And so it has these capsules in it, for each frequency you got to plug one of these in. 5 watts. It's only 5 watts, and true 5 watts. Some radios are 5 watts, but they're demanding power of 50. But the power demand is only 5. So I'll use that once in a while, but not for a soda, because I want to make sure I'm doing justice to the other side. That's just kind of a fun thing. So you get some of these. And that I got from Joe before he got he got a modern, one of the modern hybrids. He was using this for the longest time.
Is there a lesson when you have a bare wire coming down the wall in your bedroom and you plug a lamp in? That was a lesson learned. When you're operating in the field, are there any lessons that you've learned that you want to share from your field operation?
Well, it's, the KISS syndrome. Keep it simple, stupid. And, and you don't have to go so high tech, looking at every gram of weight, because in this country, you're not walking those high mountain peaks in the snow. So I can be a little less demanding, and so the budget will allow for it. So a nice radio like the all-in-one HF small older radios will do the job. You don't have to get real expensive equipment and really expensive antennas. You can make your own. Because when you're out there, you're way far away from population, so you've got a lot less interference. And the lesson is that it doesn't have to be perfect. I think that everybody kind of says, well, the the rules and regulations of electronics, who cares that you're not a one-on-one match? You don't lose that much to be 1.5 or even a 2-to-1 match on your SWR. You're still going to be heard. And so you have to be within the parameters of the science, but you don't have to be afraid not to be spot on. And then you learn by doing that. You learn that, it will work if it's not perfect.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. I think that what I've learned on listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, the secret to good field operation is setting the system up at home first, lashing it all together, making sure that it works, making sure that your power is working, that you've got the right connectors, and then breaking it all down and packing it at that point. Versus, which is what I tend to do, is I get a big plastic box and I start throwing into it all of the connectors, wires, tools, all the things I think I'm going to need in the field because I didn't set it up at home first as a working system. I somehow think I'm going to construct it for the first time in the field. What do you think about that?
Well, that's definite. Yeah, I would always go to the field that's across the street from my house, and I would do it there, as that's my test location before I get out in the middle of the Negev desert. But then one more thing is almost have a checklist, because one of the Mitzpeh Ramon crater is one of the sodas, and that was one of the further walks. It was about 1 kilometer in from the car. And I get there and I'm setting up. I forgot something. I don't remember what it was, and I forgot it. So I had to walk all the way back to the car and then all the way back to the site and to make it work. It was something simple, but, you're camping out at another location where you're activating. And so the car is a little bit overfilled with too much stuff. And I forgot it because of that. So you have to try to be as organized as possible, the Go Kit concept, and try it out, as you say, at home first, and then meticulously put it all in order so that then when you do leave the vehicle, you have it all with you. And sometimes, if it's doable, have a little bit of redundancy. Different things might break. Plugs that are not necessarily soldered, but could be put together with screws to make the connection. Some plugs of connecting wires to the antenna, those break once in a while. So if you have the ability to duplicate on certain easy things, do that. That will help in the long run.
From your perspective, Louis, since you've been in Israel since the late 70s with a breakaway, but it gives you a chance to kind of look at how the amateur radio community in Israel has evolved over time. Could you provide perhaps a historical context in terms of what you think this evolution looks like then and now? How is it different for you?
For me, it's there's a lot of mentors here that really want to help. It wasn't that they weren't there before, but it seems to be more organized now. And you go to meetings, you go to these field days to meet other hams, and there's such wealth of information of people around you, and not to be afraid of asking for the help, and then actually asking to go along on events, and you don't even take your equipment. Just use somebody else's equipment, because people are that friendly. You can't all transmit at the same time. If 7 people go to a lighthouse activation, you can really only have 3 people transmitting at once, because you have to be such different types of transmission. Otherwise, you're on top of each other, and it causes chaos. So you go without your equipment, and you learn and learn and learn from the people ahead of you. And then I think that was not available before. The other thing that I learned is there are so many different methods of radio communications. And I love practicing with other people's equipment on the outings to do against the satellite, sending via satellite. And we have the advantage of having, it's the QO 100, is that the one?
Right. That's the Qatari communication satellite. There's a geosynchronous Qatari satellite that has an amateur radio transponder.
So it's a very exciting, and I can't think that I would be able to set up that system. It's not in the budget. They're not that expensive, but you only can spend so much money on the hobby. But when you go with other people who have the field day experience with their equipment, they're more than happy to let you sit in, take your turn at the driving. And wow, it's another type of pileup that you've never heard about, that I'm sitting there talking on a satellite for a half an hour or an hour, and it's really exciting. All of these things are because of the camaraderie of the people. And that was never there before. It was just a handful of guys that had HF radios, and now it's so many varieties. It's really exciting.
And do you think that, Louis, that perhaps that friendliness and that is not necessarily desperation for new hams to replace us old hams? The number of active amateurs in Israel is probably a quarter of what it was, maybe even a sixth of what it was in the 80s.
I think there's a wave right now of new hams. We had our annual meeting last week, and I heard there was 50 new members. That's a nice number. That's a nice number for us, yeah. When there's, 600-700 active hams in Israel right now. So it's growing, and everyone wants to help the other, and you can't help everybody, so it's like there's different, not cliques, but different groups according to the types of transmission that they enjoy and the equipment that they enjoy.
Looking to the future, Louis, are there any new projects or goals that you're particularly excited about?
Well, I would like to increase my CW speed. I think of anything that just takes practice. And if there was a plead to those outside coming back the other direction towards me is, slow down. If you hear a guy like me really very slow sending out, and it's not 10 words a minute, so you can bring it down to 13 and have a little QSO out of your comfort zone. Where if a comfort zone for someone is 20, 23, 25, it is hard. I know it's hard to come down to 13, but you will really make a person's day by doing it, and ahead of time learn how to change the speed on the equipment. I asked someone on a field day, help me use your equipment, but you got to bring down the speed to 13. He says, I don't know how. I'm sure it's easy, but if he was using also somebody else's equipment, so I have to give him credit.
One of the things I know, because I took a CW Academy course, an intermediate course, and what they recommended was that you actually set the character speed for 20 words a minute. What you're slowing down is the interval between characters. So you might be sending at 10 words a minute, but the character itself is running at 20. Is that challenging for you?
No, that works. Where the challenge is, it is very hard for a person who is used to going 20, and he can do one letter, and then he has to stop. So his rhythm has been broken. Then he does another letter, and he has to stop to create the gap for the novice. So it is a very good theory. In theory, it's very good for how you as a beginner can get faster, is to learn to hear the faster letter, and then, okay, now I'm wait a second before I get ready for the next letter, and you're increasing the gap. But an old timer, they can't do it. It's just too hard. So to make them, force them to have the gap right, is they really need to turn in the switch, bring it down to 13 words a minute, and then it's forcing the rhythm of the hand. Especially if you're using electronic keyer, if they're pounding it, it's a little easier. It's a little easier to do a letter, stop, do a letter, stop. But if you're doing it sideways with squeezing or just back and forth, left and right, it's a hard thing. It really is a hard thing for them to do. I understand their hesitation to want to go slow for me. But then on the flip side, to help the other novice who is only at 13, your call sign at a faster pace. I mean, I can hear my own personal call sign 20, even 30 words a minute. I recognize my call sign because I've heard it so many times. So last month I did something very exciting. It was the AO75 from Spain had their 75th anniversary of the Spanish Ham Radio Club Society, and a month-long event where you would try to get, there was 20 stations, and you tried to get the 20 stations over the different bands, and you would get points. And they're all pumping it out at 25, 30 words a minute on CW. But I made a challenge to myself. I only send at 17 to them, and then I could hear my call sign come back if they heard me. And then I would then just repeat it with a 599 thank you at my speed. I didn't have to go up to them. They didn't have to come down to me because all they were doing is sending my call sign. And it worked. And over that month, I have to pat myself on the back. I got the number 5th for Israel in this event in terms of over a month's time period of challenging to call these frequencies. These that you saw on the different websites of when and where they were broadcasting and their own website. So I was number 5 for CW and number 6 for phone for Israel, for contestants that came from Israel. And I got their gold award, which was to have 18 of their contacts on 4 different bandwidths. And it was a challenge, but I did it. It was the first time I've ever done that. And the whole reason was I said to myself, You don't have to have a whole conversation with this guy. All you have to do is hear your call sign at the faster speed and then reply back to it. And they had pileups, but they were doable pileups. And so I felt good. There were a lot of hours on there, and it made it work.
Louis, do you have advice that you'd give to new or returning hams, the new hams that you might have met at the meeting last week? If they had come up to you and said, Louis, 4Z50T, what advice would you give me now that I have a ham radio license?
I am hesitant to say this, but the FT8, I'm on the camp that says FT8 is not ham radio, and I would give them the advice of saying, try first. That's a second level thing, to just let your computer do the action for you. Get a piece of equipment and really get into real meat and potatoes of the industry. That's the dessert of using these more advanced technologies. It's all ham radio. It's all good. But I don't think that they can develop their skills as well of just doing it through computers and the radio. So my advice was bite the bullet of going one more step beyond the easy way to make a communication. And it can be used equipment, but try to get into the old style first, because I think it's much more satisfying.
In other words, you should try to get onto single sideband or CW as a first step to build skills.
I think so. I don't think I'd say as a first skill to do CW. That might frustrate a person too much. But single sideband, I think it's worthwhile, and it's in the long run it will pay. It'll pay back. And then on the other side, on the flip side, how to help these people. I think the old timers need to understand where we're at. I'm saying we because I might be an old timer when I got my license, but it hasn't been that many years that I really delved into it in a deep manner. So if we take, for instance, contests or special DX stations, I think the DX station is missing the mark in trying to pick up the new and the weaker signal. And there are ways of trying this out, of actually, they say that they do it, I don't hear it, but just say, okay, for the next 15 minutes, we're only going to do QRP, period. I know it's a pileup. I know I'm going to have a lot of people yelling at me. But hey, let's let the QRP get through. For 15 minutes out of the whole day, a QRP, that would be amazing. Or then another with just low power. Doesn't have to be QRP. Only low power for the next 15 minutes. Let the little station have success. And that comes from the top, and it's got to come from the top, because it's too much of this, you can't get through. And I got very frustrated. That's why I had to change my whole method. I couldn't get DXs. Another way to help with the DX in spreading the wealth is that, okay, right now, I only want people with the 1 in their call sign, or a 2, or a 3, go through. Only people from, and pick a zone, and be precise. And then hopefully the others will hold back. There'll be time for the pileup to come to their zone, but do it in a more organized fashion instead of a shotgun approach. And more people will have more excitement, and it will only help. It will only help, in my opinion.
Well, Louis, I want to thank you so much for joining me on QSO today. Lewis is a friend, and we talk on All-Star, and we were talking this morning, and Lewis said that he had nothing to talk about, but everyone who is listening to this podcast now will know that Lewis had plenty of expertise to share with us on QSO Today. So, Lewis, thank you so much, 73, and I look forward to working in the field with you.
Thank you, Eric, for being perseverance of pushing my comfort zone, and definitely we'll get you out in the field, and if not a soda event, just being out in the field with your equipment is I love it, and you'll see why. Thanks again.
73, Lewis.
73, Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Lewis. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in 4Z5OT in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.